Sarah Bennett stared at the eviction notice taped to her apartment door, her 6-year-old daughter Emma tugging at her sleeve asking why their things were in boxes on the hallway floor. The paper trembled in Sarah's hands, not from fear but from exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones after 2 years of working double shifts at the diner only to watch every dollar disappear into medical bills and late fees. She had exactly $417 in her checking account, 3 garbage bags of clothes in her beaten Honda Civic, and nowhere left to go. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been 23 when she met Daniel Carter at a county fair, his charm as polished as the vintage truck he drove. By 24 she was pregnant. By 25 she was alone, Daniel having vanished the moment the pregnancy test came back positive, leaving behind nothing but a forwarding address that turned out to be fake and a voicemail inbox that was permanently full. Her parents had offered help at first, but their assistance came wrapped in judgment and conditions she couldn't stomach. Move back home. Give up your independence. Admit you made a mistake. So Sarah had chosen pride over comfort, working her way through community college while pregnant, then juggling night shifts and motherhood with a determination that impressed her coworkers but left her perpetually exhausted. The medical bills had started when Emma was 4. A persistent cough that doctors initially dismissed as allergies turned out to be a respiratory condition requiring ongoing treatment and expensive medications. Insurance covered some of it, but the deductibles and copays accumulated like snowdrifts, burying Sarah under debt she had no hope of clearing. She took on extra shifts. She sold everything of value she owned. She applied for assistance programs in charity care, navigating bureaucratic mazes while Emma slept in the break room of the diner, her small body curled up on 2 chairs pushed together. Now, standing in that hallway with the eviction notice and her daughter's confused face looking up at her, Sarah felt something inside her crack. Not break entirely, but fracture in a way that let something else seep through. Desperation, maybe. Or a reckless kind of courage that comes when you've got nothing left to lose. That night, sleeping in the car at a rest stop with Emma bundled in blankets in the back seat, Sarah scrolled through her phone looking for options. Shelters were full. Friends' couches had been exhausted months ago. Her credit was destroyed, making it impossible to rent anything legitimate. She was spiraling through anxiety when an advertisement caught her eye. County auction, distressed properties, minimum bid starting at $200. Most listings were for lots of land, abandoned buildings, properties with liens or structural issues that made them nearly worthless. But one entry made Sarah's breath catch. A farmhouse on 8 acres, minimum bid $400, located about 90 miles west in Thornton County. The description was brutally honest. No running water, extensive structural damage, possible foundation issues, sold as is with no warranty or guarantee of habitability. Sarah zoomed in on the grainy photograph. The house was a disaster, a sagging 2-story structure with a collapsed porch and windows either broken or missing entirely. The roof looked like it might cave in with the next strong wind. The land around it was overgrown with weeds and scrub brush, and what might have once been a barn was now just a skeletal frame of weathered wood. It was the kind of property that made sensible people scroll past without a second thought. But Sarah wasn't feeling sensible. She was feeling desperate and tired and willing to gamble her last $400 on the slim chance that a roof, even a terrible one, was better than sleeping in a car with winter approaching. She had grown up in rural Virginia, spent summers on her grandmother's small farm before the old woman passed and the property was sold to developers. Sarah knew about well water and septic systems, about wood stoves and vegetable gardens. She had learned to can vegetables, to patch walls, to make do with less. Those skills felt useless in the city, but out there, on that abandoned farmhouse, maybe they would be enough. The auction was held in the basement of the Thornton County Courthouse, a musty room with folding chairs and fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying insects. Sarah arrived early with Emma, who clutched her stuffed rabbit and asked questions in a whisper about where they were and why. About 30 people filled the room, most of them contractors or investors looking for properties to flip. They had the look of people who knew what they were doing, armed with clipboards and calculators and knowing smirks. The auctioneer was a tired-looking woman in her 50s who moved through the listings with mechanical efficiency. Properties sold quickly, most going for thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. Sarah's palms sweated as the farmhouse listing approached. When the photograph appeared on the projector screen, several people in the audience actually laughed. One man near the front said loudly that the place should be condemned, not auctioned. The auctioneer seemed to agree. Lot 47, 8 acres with farmhouse and outbuildings located at 2847, Old Mill Road. Property has been abandoned for approximately 15 years. Multiple code violations. No utilities. Minimum bid is $400. Do I hear 400? The room was silent. Sarah felt every eye in the place waiting to see if anyone would be foolish enough to bid. Her hand shook as she raised it. 400. The auctioneer looked almost relieved. 400 from the woman in the back. Do I hear 450? The pause stretched. Going once. Going twice. Sold to bidder 73 for $400. Just like that, Sarah owned a farmhouse. A terrible, possibly uninhabitable farmhouse, but it was hers. She paid in cash, counting out 20s with trembling fingers while Emma stood beside her and accepted a thick folder of documents she barely understood. Deed transfer papers, property surveys, disclosure forms listing every known defect and hazard. The clerk who processed the paperwork looked at Sarah with undisguised pity. You know this place has been sitting empty since 2010, right? There were squatters at one point. The county cleared them out, but the damage was extensive. I understand, Sarah said, forcing confidence into her voice she didn't feel. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive to the property took 2 hours, winding through increasingly rural roads until pavement gave way to gravel and then to dirt. The GPS signal flickered and died, forcing Sarah to navigate by the crude map included in the auction documents. When they finally turned onto what the map labeled as Old Mill Road, Sarah's heart sank. It wasn't a road so much as 2 tire ruts through overgrown grass, barely visible beneath years of neglect. The farmhouse appeared through the trees like something from a nightmare. The auction photo hadn't done justice to how bad it really was. The entire structure leaned slightly to the left, as if the foundation had given up on one side. The porch had completely collapsed, leaving a jumble of rotted wood and rusted nails. Most windows were broken, their frames empty or hanging with shards of glass like teeth. The roof sagged in the middle, several shingles missing, and Sarah could see daylight through holes in some places. Behind the house, the skeletal remains of a barn stood against the gray November sky, and beyond that, fields stretched into woods, everything choked with brambles and saplings. Emma started to cry. Mama, this place is scary. Sarah pulled her daughter close, fighting back her own tears. It's okay, baby. We're going to make it nice. You'll see. But as Sarah climbed out of the car and approached the house, doubt crashed over her in waves. What had she done? She had spent every dollar she had on a property that might not even be salvageable. There was no electricity, no water, no heat. Winter was coming. She had a 6-year-old daughter who needed stability and safety, and Sarah had just gambled their last hope on a pile of rotting wood in the middle of nowhere. The front door hung open, the lock long since broken. Sarah stepped carefully over the threshold, testing each floorboard before putting her full weight on it. Inside, the destruction was even worse. The walls were covered in water stains and mold. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, old newspapers, and things Sarah didn't want to examine too closely. The smell of decay and animal waste made her gag. In what must have once been a living room, someone had spray-painted obscene graffiti across the walls. The kitchen was a disaster of rusted appliances and cabinets hanging off their hinges. Sarah moved through the house in a daze, cataloging the damage. Every room told the same story of abandonment and decay. Upstairs, The bedrooms were in marginally better condition, at least structurally, though one ceiling had a hole large enough to see the attic above. The bathroom was a ruin, the toilet cracked, the sink torn from the wall, the bathtub filled with leaves and debris that had blown in through a broken window. She returned downstairs to find Emma still sitting in the car, refusing to come inside. Sarah couldn't blame her. The house looked like it should be demolished, not lived in. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard, Sarah forced herself to think practically. They couldn't stay here tonight, not without light or heat or any way to secure the doors. She would have to find a motel, spend money she didn't have, and figure out what to do next. As she walked back toward the car, something caught her eye. Behind the house, partially hidden by overgrown bushes, was what looked like an old stone cellar. The doors were set at an angle into the ground, the kind of entrance that led to underground storage spaces common in old farmhouses. Sarah pushed through the brush and examined the doors. They were heavy wood, weathered but intact, secured with a rusted padlock. Something about the cellar nagged at her. The padlock was old but not as old as the house. Someone had secured this entrance relatively recently, maybe within the last decade. Why would anyone bother locking a stone cellar in an abandoned house? Sarah returned to the car and dug through the auction documents until she found the property survey. It showed the house, the barn, and the boundaries of the 8 acres, but there was no mention of a cellar or any underground structures. She looked back at the weathered doors, curiosity beginning to override her despair. The next morning, after a fitful night in a cheap motel where Emma finally fell asleep around midnight, Sarah returned to the property with a crowbar she had bought at a hardware store. She had also picked up some basic supplies, flashlights, garbage bags, work gloves, and a first aid kit. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Emma watched from the car as Sarah approached the cellar doors. The padlock was old enough that the crowbar made quick work of it, the metal cracking and falling away after a few solid hits. Sarah pulled open the doors, releasing a rush of cool, stale air that smelled of earth and something else, something metallic. Stone steps led down into darkness. Sarah clicked on her flashlight and descended carefully, each step solid beneath her feet. The cellar was larger than she expected, easily 20 feet square, with stone walls and a dirt floor. Old shelves lined one wall, still holding dusty jars of preserves that must have been decades old. In the corner sat a rusted water pump and what looked like the remnants of a root cellar storage system. But it was the far wall that made Sarah's breath catch. Unlike the other walls, which were made of rough fieldstone, this wall had been constructed more recently, using cinder blocks that didn't match the rest of the cellar's construction. And in the center of that wall, barely visible beneath years of dust and cobwebs, was a wooden door with a modern combination lock. Sarah approached slowly, her heart pounding. Someone had built this door, had secured it, had hidden something beyond it. The door frame was solid, the lock industrial grade and far more substantial than the one that had secured the cellar entrance. This wasn't just storage. This was protection. She tried the door handle. Locked, as expected. The combination lock had 4 wheels, each numbered 0 through 9. 10,000 possible combinations. Sarah didn't have the time or patience to try them all, but as she examined the lock more closely, she noticed something scratched into the wooden frame beside it. Numbers, barely visible, carved into the wood, 1863. With trembling fingers, Sarah tried the combination. 1, 8, 6, 3. The lock clicked open. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a narrow tunnel that extended beyond the reach of her flashlight beam. The walls were supported by old timber beams, the floor packed earth mixed with gravel. And running along both walls were rusted iron rails, the kind used in mining operations. Sarah stood at the threshold of the tunnel, her mind racing. This property, this abandoned farmhouse she had bought for $400, had a secret. A tunnel, carefully hidden and secured, that led somewhere into the darkness beneath her land. The date on the lock, 1863, echoed in her mind. The Civil War. Thornton County was in Virginia, right in the heart of what had been Confederate territory. She thought about the risks. The tunnel could be unstable, could collapse. It could lead nowhere, just an old mining shaft abandoned a century ago. But something in Sarah's gut, the same desperate instinct that had made her bid on this property in the first place, told her this mattered. This was important. As she stood there, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of the tunnel, Emma's voice called from above. "Mama? Where are you?" "Coming, baby," Sarah called back. She took one last look into the tunnel, then carefully closed and locked the door. Whatever secrets lay beyond, they would have to wait. She had a daughter to care for and a house to somehow make livable before winter truly arrived. But as Sarah climbed back up the stone steps into the gray November light, she couldn't shake the feeling that her $400 gamble had just become something much more significant. Something that had been waiting in the darkness for over 150 years, waiting for someone desperate or foolish enough to find it. Sarah spent the first week in survival mode, ignoring the tunnel entirely while she focused on making the farmhouse barely habitable. With Emma beside her, asking endless questions and sometimes crying from exhaustion, Sarah worked from sunrise until her flashlight batteries died each night. She cleared debris from 2 upstairs bedrooms, swept away years of dust and animal droppings, and covered the broken windows with plastic sheeting and duct tape. The November wind still found its way through gaps in the walls, but it was better than nothing. The well behind the house still worked, miraculously, though the water came up rust-colored for the first several pumps before running clear and cold. Sarah boiled it on a camping stove she had bought with the last of her credit card limit, rationing propane like it was gold. They ate canned soup and crackers, slept in sleeping bags on the bare floor, and used a bucket with a trash bag for a toilet until Sarah could figure out if the septic system was salvageable. Emma never complained, not once, which broke Sarah's heart more than any tantrum could have. Her daughter had learned too young that complaining changed nothing, that adults couldn't always fix things, that sometimes you just had to endure. At night, by the light of battery-powered lanterns, Emma would draw pictures of what she wanted the house to look like someday. Flowers in window boxes. A tire swing in the yard. A porch where they could sit and drink lemonade. Sarah would look at those drawings and feel the weight of her daughter's hope pressing against her chest like a stone. During the day, while Emma played with her few toys in the cleanest bedroom, Sarah explored the property more thoroughly. The 8 acres were mostly overgrown field reverting to forest, thick with brambles and saplings. The barn was beyond saving, its frame so rotted that Sarah wouldn't risk going inside. But as she walked the property boundaries, following the old fence line marked by rusted wire and weathered posts, she began to notice things. The land sloped gently toward the back of the property, where a creek cut through the woods. Near that creek, partially hidden by undergrowth, were the remains of old stone foundations, structures that had stood here long before the farmhouse. Sarah found other traces too. Rusted metal objects she couldn't identify. Pieces of old glass bottles, some with embossed lettering too worn to read. And in several places, the ground itself seemed different, slightly sunken, as if something beneath had collapsed or been filled in. The more she explored, the more convinced she became that this property had a history deeper than the farmhouse itself, a past that someone had tried to conceal. It was Thanksgiving week when Sarah finally returned to the tunnel. Emma was occupied with coloring books, bundled in every warm piece of clothing they owned, singing softly to herself. Sarah descended the stone steps into the cellar, unlocked the hidden door, and stepped into the passage that had haunted her thoughts for days. The tunnel was taller than she had first realized, easily 7 feet high, with support beams that looked old but solid. The rails on the floor were definitely mining rails, the kind used to push carts full of ore or coal. But this wasn't mining country, at least not according to anything Sarah had researched about Thornton County. The area had been agricultural, known for tobacco and cotton before the Civil War, cattle and timber after. Sarah followed the tunnel, her flashlight beam cutting through darkness that felt thick and alive. The air was cool and damp, carrying that metallic scent she had noticed before, along with something else, something earthy and ancient. The tunnel ran straight for about 50 feet before angling slightly to the left. The walls showed pick marks where someone had carved through rock and clay, a massive undertaking that would have required significant labor and time. After what Sarah estimated was about 200 feet, the tunnel opened into a chamber. This space was larger, roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, with a ceiling that rose to a natural dome. And scattered across the chamber floor were wooden crates, dozens of them, stacked against the walls and covered with rotting canvas tarps. Sarah's hands shook as she approached the nearest crate. It was old, the wood dark with age and moisture, but still intact. Iron bands reinforced the corners, and stenciled on the side in faded paint were letters, CSA followed by numbers Sarah couldn't quite make out. Confederate States of America. She pried open the crate with the crowbar she had brought, the wood splitting easily after more than a century and a half. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that crumbled at her touch, were bars of metal. Gold bars. Each one roughly the size of a brick, stamped with markings Sarah didn't recognize but couldn't mistake. She lifted one out, surprised by its weight, and held it under her flashlight. The metal gleamed dully, real and solid and impossible. Sarah set it down carefully and moved to another crate. More gold. And another. And another. Some crates held bars, others held coins, still others contained what looked like jewelry and silverware, the kind of valuables people would have donated or had confiscated during wartime. There were dozens of crates, more than Sarah could count in her shock, each one holding a fortune that had been hidden in this chamber for over 150 years. She sank to the ground, her legs unable to support her, and tried to process what she was seeing. This wasn't just hidden treasure. This was Confederate gold, likely part of the massive amounts of wealth that had supposedly disappeared when the South fell. Stories of lost Confederate gold were legendary throughout the South, most of them dismissed as myth or long since looted. But here it was, beneath the abandoned farmhouse Sarah had bought for $400, waiting in the darkness like a secret the earth itself had been keeping. The implications crashed over her in waves. This gold didn't belong to her, not morally, even if legally the property and everything on it was hers. This was stolen wealth, taken from enslaved people, from occupied territories, from the blood-soaked economy of a failed rebellion. But it was also the answer to every problem Sarah faced. Medical bills. Debt. Security for Emma. A future that didn't involve choosing between food and medicine. Sarah stayed in that chamber for over an hour, sitting among crates of gold while her mind spun through possibilities and consequences. She thought about her grandmother, who had survived the Depression by hiding money in the walls of her farmhouse, who had taught Sarah that sometimes survival required doing things that felt wrong. She thought about Emma, drawing pictures of flowers in window boxes, deserving a childhood that wasn't defined by poverty and fear. She thought about Daniel, who had abandoned them both, and her parents, who had offered help wrapped in shame, and every person who had looked at her with pity when they learned she was a single mother struggling to get by. When Sarah finally climbed back out of the tunnel, locking both doors behind her, the sun was setting and Emma was calling for her, hungry and cold. Sarah fed her daughter canned ravioli heated on the camping stove and tucked her into the sleeping bag with every blanket they owned. Then she sat by the window, watching darkness claim the overgrown fields, and tried to figure out what to do next. The answer came from an unexpected source. The next morning, a truck pulled up the rutted driveway, and a man in his 60s climbed out. He was weathered and lean, wearing work clothes and a cap that had seen better days. He approached the house cautiously, as if unsure of his welcome. Sarah met him on what remained of the porch, Emma peering out from behind her legs. "Can I help you?" The man studied her for a long moment. "Name's Marcus Webb. I own the property to the west, about half a mile through those woods. Heard someone finally bought this place. Wanted to introduce myself and, well, warn you about a few things." Sarah gestured for him to continue, her guard immediately up. Marcus shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "This property's got a history. Used to belong to the Pritchard family before the war. They were plantation owners, had about 200 enslaved people working tobacco fields that used to stretch from here to the river. When the war started, Clayton Pritchard was a quartermaster for the Confederate Army. Word was he diverted supplies and gold, hiding things for after the war. He paused, his eyes moving to the collapsed barn, then back to Sarah. He didn't survive to come back for it. Got killed at Petersburg in '64. The family lost everything after the war, and this land was seized and sold. Sarah kept her expression neutral, but her heart was pounding. What happened to whatever he hid? Marcus shrugged. Most folks figured if there was anything hidden, it got found years ago. Properties changed hands a dozen times since Reconstruction. Each owner thought they might find something, but nobody ever did. Place has been abandoned since the last owners went bankrupt back in 2010. He looked at Sarah more closely. You plan on staying? Trying to fix this place up? That's the plan, Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. Well, if you need help, I'm good with repairs. Used to be a contractor before I retired. And if you find anything unusual on the property, anything historical, you should probably report it. State's got laws about that sort of thing, especially if it's Civil War related. After Marcus left, Sarah stood in the yard for a long time, watching his truck disappear down the dirt road. He knew. Maybe not specifically about the gold, but he knew something was hidden here. And he had just told her that anything she found should be reported to the state. Which meant it would be seized, cataloged, and likely end up in a museum or government warehouse while Sarah received nothing but a footnote in some historical record. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her sleeping bag, listening to Emma's soft breathing and the wind rattling the plastic over the windows, and wrestled with a decision that felt too big for one person to make. The gold represented everything she needed, but it also represented blood and suffering, a fortune built on the backs of enslaved people and hidden by someone who had fought to preserve that evil system. But Sarah also knew what happened to people who did the right thing when they couldn't afford to. They stayed poor. They stayed desperate. Their children went without. The system didn't reward moral certainty, especially not for single mothers with medical debt and no safety net. The decision crystallized over the next few days as Sarah researched what would actually happen if she reported the find. The state would seize everything. There would be investigations, historical assessments, legal battles over ownership. The property would be tied up for years while historians and lawyers argued. Sarah would get nothing except the satisfaction of having done the right thing, and that satisfaction wouldn't keep Emma warm or pay for her medications. Sarah made her choice. She would keep the gold secret. She would sell it slowly, carefully, through channels that didn't ask questions. She would use the money to fix up the farmhouse, to build the life Emma deserved, to create something good from something terrible. It wasn't moral, but it was practical. It wasn't just, but it was survival. The first piece Sarah took was a single bar of gold, small enough to carry but valuable enough to change everything. She drove 3 hours to Richmond, to a dealer Marcus had mentioned once who bought estate jewelry and antiques, no questions asked. The man was thin and nervous, working out of a cluttered shop that smelled of old paper and desperation. He examined the bar under a magnifying glass, tested it with acid, and weighed it on an electronic scale. "Where'd you get this?" he asked, his eyes sharp despite his casual tone. "Estate sale," Sarah lied smoothly. "Old family property." The man studied her, clearly not believing but also not caring enough to push. 14,000. Cash. Final offer. Sarah took the money, $14,000 in $100 bills, and drove back to Thornton County in a daze. She stopped at a hardware store and bought real supplies, a generator, power tools, lumber, insulation, proper work clothes. She stopped at a grocery store and bought fresh food, the kind Emma loved but Sarah could never afford. Chicken, fresh vegetables, milk, real bread. At a department store, she bought Emma winter clothes that actually fit and weren't from a thrift store. When she returned to the farmhouse, Emma's face lit up in a way Sarah hadn't seen in months. "Real food, Mama? We have real food?" "Yes, baby. We have real food now." Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah transformed the farmhouse. With the generator providing power, she could work after dark, insulating walls and replacing windows. She hired Marcus Webb to help with the heavy repairs, and the old man worked with surprising efficiency, never asking where Sarah had gotten the money for supplies. Together they replaced rotted floor joists, patched the roof, and installed a wood stove that could heat the entire downstairs. Emma blossomed as the house became more livable. She started laughing again, running through the rooms that were slowly becoming a real home. Sarah enrolled her in the local elementary school, and Emma made friends with children whose parents didn't look at Sarah with the same pity she had endured in the city. Out here, being poor wasn't shameful. It was just a fact of life, something everyone understood. But Sarah's secret weighed on her. Every night, after Emma was asleep, she would lie awake thinking about the gold beneath their home, about Clayton Pritchard and the enslaved people who had suffered to create that wealth, about what it meant to build her daughter's future on such a dark foundation. She told herself she was doing what any mother would do, taking what was available to protect her child. But she also knew that justification was thin, a story she told herself to sleep at night. The confrontation came in late December, 2 days before Christmas. Sarah had just sold another bar of gold, this time through a different dealer in Norfolk, and had used the money to buy Emma a real Christmas, a tree, presents, decorations. She was stringing lights on the porch when a car pulled up, expensive and clean, completely out of place on the muddy farm road. The woman who emerged was in her 40s, dressed in professional clothes that screamed lawyer or government official. Behind her came a man with a camera and another with surveying equipment. "Sarah Bennett?" The woman called, approaching with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Jennifer Hastings, Virginia State Historical Preservation Office. We need to talk about your property." Sarah's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression neutral. "What about it?" "We've received information that there may be significant Civil War artifacts on this land." The woman's eyes moved past Sarah to the house, then to the fields beyond. "Under state law, any discoveries of historical significance must be reported and preserved. I have a court order here allowing us to survey the property." She held out papers, official and legal and devastating. Sarah took them with shaking hands, scanning the text. Someone had reported her. Marcus? The gold dealers? It didn't matter. They knew, or at least suspected, and they were here to take away the only hope Sarah had of building a real future for Emma. "You can't just search my property without permission," Sarah said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "Actually, we can." Jennifer's tone was polite but firm. "This is a matter of preserving state history. Any artifacts found will be cataloged and protected. You'll be compensated fairly for any disruption, of course. But not for what they find," Sarah thought bitterly. "Not for the gold that could change everything." She watched, helpless, as the surveyors began mapping the property with GPS equipment. The man with the camera started documenting the farmhouse, the collapsed barn, the overgrown fields. They would find the cellar eventually, in the tunnel, in the chamber full of Confederate gold. And Sarah would go back to being exactly what she was before, desperate, broke, and out of options. That night, with Emma crying because strange people were walking around their home with flashlights and equipment, Sarah made another decision. If they were going to take the gold, she would take what she could first. She would hide it somewhere they couldn't find, somewhere beyond their court orders and legal authority. It was theft, but then again, so was poverty. So was watching your child suffer because the world was designed to keep people like Sarah exactly where they were. Sarah waited until after midnight, when the surveyors had left and Emma was finally asleep. She descended into the tunnel one last time and loaded a backpack with as many gold coins as she could carry. Not bars, which were too distinctive, but coins that could be sold individually over time, slowly, carefully. She took what she could carry and sealed the chamber, knowing it would be discovered soon but hoping that what she'd taken would be enough. As she climbed back up the stone steps into the December cold, Sarah heard a voice from the darkness. "I thought you might try something like this." Jennifer Hastings stepped into the moonlight, her expression unreadable. Behind her, standing near their official vehicles, were 2 men who looked like security or law enforcement. Sarah's heart hammered, the backpack suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I'm not doing anything wrong. This is my property. That backpack looks heavy, Jennifer observed. Want to show me what's inside? The two women stood facing each other in the cold night air, the farmhouse dark behind them, Emma sleeping inside unaware that everything was about to collapse again. Sarah thought about running, about fighting, about all the choices that had led her to this moment. Buying the farmhouse. Finding the tunnel. Taking the gold. Every decision made out of desperation, every choice narrowing the path until there was nowhere left to go but forward into whatever consequences waited. Tell me something, Sarah said finally, her voice quiet but steady. If you were me, if you had a sick kid and no money and you found something that could save you both, what would you do? Jennifer's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Something that might have been understanding or might have been pity. I'd like to think I'd do the right thing. And what is the right thing? Sarah asked. Let the state take everything while I go back to sleeping in my car? Watch my daughter suffer because I followed the rules? The silence stretched between them, heavy with questions neither woman could answer. Finally, Jennifer spoke, her voice softer than before. There might be another way. Come to my office tomorrow. Bring your daughter. Let's talk about this properly, before you make a decision you can't take back. Sarah barely slept that night. She lay on the floor beside Emma, the backpack of gold coins hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the corner, and stared at the ceiling where moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof they hadn't yet repaired. Jennifer Hastings' words echoed in her mind. There might be another way. But Sarah had learned long ago that when people with power offered alternatives, those alternatives usually benefited everyone except the person who needed help most. Morning came gray and cold, threatening snow. Sarah dressed Emma in the warmest clothes they had and made breakfast from the last of the fresh groceries, pancakes with real maple syrup that made Emma's eyes light up. As they ate, Sarah studied her daughter's face, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way she hummed while she chewed, the absolute trust in her eyes when she looked at her mother. Everything Sarah had done, every questionable choice, every line she had crossed, had been for this child. That had to count for something. The drive to Richmond took 3 hours through increasingly heavy traffic. The Virginia State Historical Preservation Office was housed in a modern building that felt sterile and impersonal after weeks of living in the drafty farmhouse. Jennifer Hastings met them in the lobby, her professional demeanor softened slightly when she saw Emma clutching Sarah's hand. Thank you for coming, Jennifer said, leading them to a conference room with large windows overlooking the city. She gestured for them to sit, then took a chair across from them rather than behind the imposing desk. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Hot chocolate for Emma? Emma looked to Sarah, who nodded. Hot chocolate would be nice. While Jennifer left to arrange drinks, Sarah surveyed the room. The walls were covered with framed photographs of historical sites throughout Virginia, plantation houses and Civil War battlefields and colonial settlements. Each one represented a piece of history that had been preserved, cataloged, and turned into a teaching tool. Each one had probably displaced someone, disrupted someone's life in the name of historical significance. Jennifer returned with hot chocolate for Emma and coffee for the adults. She sat down and pulled out a file folder, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, she looked directly at Sarah with an expression that seemed genuinely concerned rather than merely professional. I did some research on you after we spoke last night, Jennifer said quietly. I know about your medical debt. I know about Emma's condition. I know you were evicted from your apartment and bought the Pritchard property at auction for $400. She paused. I also know what it's like to be a single mother trying to do right by your child when the world keeps pushing you down. Sarah said nothing, waiting for the trap she was certain was coming. The state's position is clear, Jennifer continued. Any Confederate gold found on Virginia property belongs to the Commonwealth. It's historically significant and must be preserved. That's the law. She opened the folder, revealing photographs of the tunnel entrance. We found the cellar yesterday afternoon. We haven't accessed the chamber yet because we need proper archaeological protocols, but we know what's down there. So you're here to tell me you're taking it all, Sarah said flatly. And I get nothing except the satisfaction of having contributed to Virginia's historical preservation. Jennifer shook her head. I'm here to tell you that the law has some flexibility, especially in cases where the property owner has demonstrated good faith and cooperation. She pulled out another document. There's a provision for compensation when historically significant artifacts are discovered on private property. It's not the full value, but it's substantial. We're talking about enough money to clear your debts, maintain the property, and provide security for Emma's future. Sarah studied the document, her lawyer's instincts from her incomplete college education kicking in despite her exhaustion. How substantial? Based on preliminary estimates of what we believe is in that chamber, probably around $200,000. It would take several months to process, but it's guaranteed by the state. $200,000. It was more money than Sarah had ever imagined having, enough to transform their lives completely. But it was a fraction of what the gold was actually worth, millions of dollars that would instead go to museums and state coffers while Sarah received what amounted to a finder's fee. And if I refuse? Sarah asked. If I claim I didn't know anything about the gold, that I just bought an abandoned farmhouse and you're the ones who found it? Jennifer's expression hardened slightly. Then we investigate how you suddenly had money for extensive renovations on a property you bought for $400. We talk to the gold dealers you visited in Richmond and Norfolk. We examine your bank records and charge you with theft of state property. You'd go to jail, Sarah. And Emma would go into foster care while you fought a legal battle you cannot win. The threat hung in the air between them, polite but absolutely clear. Sarah felt rage building in her chest, the same fury she had felt when Daniel abandoned them, when her parents offered help wrapped in shame, when the hospital billing department called for the 10th time about overdue payments. The world was designed to keep people like her desperate, to make sure that even when fortune literally fell into her lap, it would be taken away by those with the power to take. But beneath the rage was something else. Exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of fighting a system that would always have more resources, more time, more power than she could ever muster. And there was Emma, sitting beside her drinking hot chocolate, her daughter who deserved stability more than Sarah deserved revenge against an unfair world. What would the compensation actually cover? Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. Jennifer pulled out a calculator and a detailed breakdown. $200,000. After taxes, probably $140,000. Enough to pay off your medical debt, which I estimate at around $60,000. That leaves $80,000 for property improvements, establishing a trust for Emma's ongoing medical care, and providing you with a financial cushion while you figure out sustainable income. And the property? Do I get to keep it? The property is yours, purchased legally at public auction. The state has no claim to the land itself, only to the historical artifacts found on it. Jennifer leaned forward. Sarah, I know this feels unfair. I know you found something valuable and it seems like we're taking it away. But that gold was stolen. It represents suffering and evil that this state is still grappling with. Using it to build museums and educational programs, to teach people about the reality of slavery and the Civil War, that's not just bureaucracy. It's justice. Justice, Sarah repeated bitterly. You know what justice would be? Justice would be my daughter having the medication she needs without me having to choose between rent and prescriptions. Justice would be a living wage and affordable healthcare. Justice would be not having to live in my car because I can't afford a security deposit. You're right, Jennifer said quietly. You're absolutely right. The system is broken. But stealing Confederate gold won't fix it. It'll just make you a criminal. The truth of that statement settled over Sarah like a weight. She looked at Emma, who was watching the adults with the careful attention of a child who had learned that adult conversations determined her fate. Sarah thought about the backpack hidden under the floorboards at home, the coins she had already taken. She thought about the dealers in Richmond and Norfolk who had bought her gold bars without asking questions. She thought about the line between survival and criminality, and how thin that line became when you were drowning. "I need time to think," Sarah said finally. Jennifer nodded. "Take the weekend." "But Sarah, understand this, the excavation team arrives Monday morning whether you cooperate or not. The difference is whether you face this as a partner or as a suspect." The drive back to Thornton County was silent except for Emma's questions about the tall buildings and whether they could stop for French fries. Sarah bought her daughter a Happy Meal at a McDonald's, watching Emma play with the toy and feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Sarah descended into the tunnel one last time. She stood in the chamber surrounded by crates of gold that would soon be cataloged and removed, transported to climate-controlled facilities where historians would study and preserve them. She thought about Clayton Pritchard, the Confederate quartermaster who had stolen this wealth and hidden it here, planning to retrieve it after the war and rebuild his fortune. He had died at Petersburg, killed in a siege, and his secret had died with him. Until Sarah, desperate and poor, had stumbled into his carefully preserved crime. Sarah opened one of the crates and lifted out a gold bar, holding it under her flashlight. The metal gleamed, beautiful and heavy and tainted by the blood and suffering that had created it. This wasn't just money. It was evidence of evil, a physical manifestation of a system that had valued profit over humanity. And Sarah had wanted to use it to save her daughter, to build a better life, without thinking about what that meant or what it said about her own willingness to benefit from historical horror. She set the bar down carefully and climbed back out of the chamber, sealing the door behind her. Upstairs, she retrieved the backpack from its hiding place and counted the coins she had taken. 37 gold coins, each one worth thousands of dollars. Enough to disappear, to change their names and start over somewhere far from Virginia and its historical preservation laws. Or enough to return, to demonstrate good faith, to show Jennifer Hastings that Sarah Bennett was someone who could be trusted to do the right thing even when it cost her everything. The decision came to Sarah in the early hours of Sunday morning, watching sunrise paint the overgrown fields with gold light. She would return the coins. She would cooperate with the state. She would take the compensation they offered and build a life from it, a smaller life than the Confederate gold could have provided, but a life she could look Emma in the eye about. A life not built on stolen wealth and historical horror but on hard work and the small justice of being treated fairly by a system that rarely treated people like her fairly at all. Monday morning, when the excavation team arrived with their equipment and protocols, Sarah met them at the cellar entrance. She handed Jennifer the backpack of coins without explanation, and Jennifer accepted it without comment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Sarah had chosen the harder path, the moral path, and Jennifer had been right that it would cost her the fortune she might have had. The excavation took 3 weeks. Teams of archaeologists and historians cataloged every item in the chamber, photographing and documenting each piece. News crews arrived, turning Sarah's property into a media sensation. The story of the Confederate gold hidden beneath an abandoned farmhouse captivated people, and Sarah found herself giving interviews she didn't want to give, answering questions about how she felt watching millions of dollars being removed from her property. She always gave the same answer. The gold never belonged to me. It belonged to the people who suffered to create it. If my part in this story is just finding it and bringing it to light, that's enough. The compensation check arrived in late January, $143,000 after taxes. Sarah stared at the number on the bank statement, a sum that 6 months ago would have felt like winning the lottery but now felt almost inadequate after seeing the fortune that had been removed from her property. But it was real money, clean money, money she could use without guilt or fear. She paid off every medical bill, watching Emma's file be marked paid in full with a satisfaction that felt more valuable than any amount of gold. She hired contractors to complete the farmhouse renovations properly, with permits and inspections and everything done legally. She established a trust for Emma's ongoing medical care, ensuring her daughter would have access to treatment regardless of what happened to Sarah. And she saved the rest, putting it in conservative investments that would grow slowly but reliably, building security rather than spending on luxuries they didn't need. By spring, the farmhouse was transformed. The roof was solid, the windows new, the floors level and clean. Sarah had painted the exterior a cheerful yellow with white trim, and Emma had helped plant flowers along the new front porch. The fields were still overgrown, but Sarah had plans for those too, vague ideas about sustainable farming or maybe leasing the land to Marcus Webb, who had continued helping with repairs and had become something like family. Emma thrived in her new environment. Her respiratory condition, properly managed with the medications they could now afford, improved dramatically in the clean country air. She made friends at school, brought home art projects and spelling tests marked with gold stars. She never asked about the gold or the excavation or why strangers had taken things from their home. She only knew that her mother had somehow made everything better, that they had a real home now, and that was enough. On a warm April evening, Sarah sat on the porch watching Emma play in the yard, chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk. Marcus Webb pulled up in his truck, as he often did these days, bringing fresh vegetables from his garden and staying for dinner. They had developed an easy friendship, two people who understood hard work and harder choices, who didn't need to fill silence with empty conversation. "You did good with this place," Marcus said, settling into the rocking chair beside Sarah. "Most people would have cut and run after everything that happened." "I thought about it," Sarah admitted. "More than once." "But you didn't." Marcus looked at her with something like respect. "You made the hard choice, the one that lets you sleep at night. That takes courage most people don't have." Sarah wasn't sure about courage. Mostly it felt like survival, like doing what had to be done because the alternatives were worse. But maybe that was what courage looked like in real life, not grand gestures but small decisions made day after day to keep moving forward despite the weight of it all. Jennifer Hastings called in early May with news. The gold had been authenticated and valued at just over $8 million. It would be divided between several museums and historical sites, used to create educational programs about the Civil War and slavery. A portion would fund scholarships for descendants of enslaved people. The Pritchard Farmhouse property would receive a historical marker, noting it as the site where one of the largest Confederate gold caches had been discovered. "You'll be mentioned in the historical record," Jennifer said. Sarah Bennett, who purchased the property in 2025 and cooperated fully with its excavation and preservation. "That matters, Sarah. What you did matters." After the call ended, Sarah sat on the porch thinking about legacy and meaning. Her name would appear in history books as a footnote, the person who found something valuable and gave it up for the right reasons. Emma would grow up knowing her mother had made a choice that prioritized justice over wealth, community benefit over personal gain. That was worth something, even if it wasn't worth $8 million. Summer arrived with heat that made the field shimmer and turned the creek into a vital gathering place where Emma splashed with her friends. Sarah found work managing the office for a local agricultural cooperative, using organizational skills she hadn't known she possessed. The pay was modest but steady, and it came with health insurance that actually covered Emma's medications. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah felt something approaching stability, the sense that the ground beneath her feet was solid enough to build on. Marcus Webb became more than a friend as the months passed, his quiet presence evolving into something neither of them had been looking for but both seemed to need. He understood Sarah's history without needing details, respected her independence while offering support when she needed it. Emma adored him, and he treated her with the gentle patience of someone who understood what it meant to be fragile and strong at the same time. On a golden October afternoon, exactly 1 year after Sarah had bought the property, she stood at the edge of the fields with Emma beside her. The historical marker had been installed that morning, a bronze plaque noting the discovery of Confederate gold and the importance of preserving historical truth. Tourists would come eventually, people wanting to see where history had been hidden and brought to light. Sarah wasn't sure how she felt about that, about her home becoming a destination for curiosity seekers, but she supposed it was part of the price of her choice. "Mama," Emma said, tugging at Sarah's hand. "Are we going to stay here forever?" Sarah looked down at her daughter, 7 years old now and growing stronger every day. "Would you want to?" Emma nodded vigorously. "I like it here. It's home." "Home." Sarah tested the word in her mind, feeling its weight and warmth. For so long, home had been a fantasy, a place that existed in other people's lives but never in hers. But here, in this farmhouse she had bought with her last $400, on this land that had held so many secrets, Sarah had somehow built exactly that. Not the life she had imagined back when she was desperate and sleeping in her car, but a life that felt real and earned and worth protecting. That evening, after Emma was asleep and the farmhouse was quiet except for the familiar creaks and sighs of old wood settling, Sarah walked down to the cellar one final time. The tunnel entrance had been sealed by the state, filled with concrete to prevent looters or curiosity seekers from accessing the now empty chamber. But Sarah could still remember the moment she had first opened that hidden door, the way her flashlight had cut through darkness to reveal a secret that changed everything. She had been looking for shelter, for a roof over her daughter's head, for one last desperate chance to build something from nothing. Instead, she had found a test, a choice that revealed who she was when faced with wealth that came at the cost of her integrity. She had passed that test, though it had cost her millions of dollars and the easy path to security. But what she had gained felt more valuable than gold, a sense of self-respect and moral clarity that let her face Emma without shame, that let her sleep without nightmares of consequences catching up. The abandoned farmhouse that had seemed like Sarah's last desperate gamble had become her proving ground, the place where she learned that sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't the ones you keep but the ones you give up for the right reasons. The Confederate gold was gone, locked away in museums where it could teach rather than corrupt. But Sarah remained, and Emma remained, and the life they were building together on this haunted, historical, impossibly ordinary piece of Virginia farmland. That was worth more than $8 million in stolen gold. That was worth everything. 3 years had passed since the excavation, and the farmhouse stood solid against the Virginia sky, its yellow paint softened by weather but still bright enough to catch morning light. Sarah sat on the porch with her coffee, watching mist rise from the fields where she and Marcus had finally cleared the undergrowth and planted cover crops, clover and rye that would enrich the soil and prepare it for something more permanent. The land was healing, slowly reclaiming its purpose after decades of abandonment. Emma was 9 now, and her laughter carried from the barn where Marcus was teaching her to repair an old tractor he had rescued from a neighbor's property. The girl's respiratory issues had become manageable, almost ordinary, just another part of life that required attention but no longer defined their existence. She had friends who came over to play in the creek, sleepovers where girls braided each other's hair and whispered secrets that had nothing to do with poverty or fear. Sarah watched her daughter's childhood unfold with a gratitude that felt almost physical, a weight in her chest that reminded her every day what might have been lost. The historical marker at the edge of the property had brought unexpected attention. Tourists stopped occasionally, taking photographs and reading about the Confederate gold discovery. Some knocked on the door asking questions, and Sarah had learned to give brief, polite answers that satisfied curiosity without inviting deeper intrusion. The story had made national news for a brief cycle, Sarah's face appearing in articles about historical preservation and moral choice, before the world moved on to newer scandals and discoveries. She was grateful for the obscurity that followed, for the chance to build a life that wasn't constantly examined or judged. Marcus had proposed last Christmas, a quiet moment on this same porch with no grand gestures or dramatic speeches. Just a simple question about whether she thought they might want to make their partnership official, for practical reasons if nothing else. Sarah had said yes, not because she needed rescue or validation, but because she had learned to recognize genuine partnership when it appeared. They had married in March at the county courthouse with Emma as their witness, then celebrated with a small dinner at Marcus's farmhouse with neighbors who had become family. The blended household worked because neither of them tried to erase what had come before. Marcus understood that Sarah's independence wasn't rejection but survival instinct, hard-won and not easily surrendered. Sarah understood that Marcus's careful generosity came from his own history of loss, a wife who had died young and children who had moved away and rarely called. They gave each other space and support in equal measure, building something that felt sustainable because it wasn't built on need but on choice. Jennifer Hastings visited occasionally, no longer as an official but as something approaching a friend. She had shepherded the gold through authentication and distribution, ensuring it went to institutions that would use it for education rather than simply locking it away. The scholarships funded by the Pritchard Gold had already helped a dozen students attend college, descendants of enslaved people building futures that slavery had tried to deny their ancestors. Jennifer brought updates on these students sometimes, photographs and stories that reminded Sarah her choice had ripples extending far beyond this farmhouse. On one visit in late summer, Jennifer brought news that surprised them both. "We found additional records about Clayton Pritchard," she said, spreading documents across Sarah's kitchen table. "He didn't steal all that gold himself. He had help from someone unexpected." The documents revealed that Pritchard had worked with a free black blacksmith named Isaiah Crawford, who had used his position of relative privilege to gather information about Confederate supply movements. Crawford had been part of the Underground Railroad, hiding escaped slaves and passing intelligence to Union forces. The gold Pritchard hoarded had been meant as payment for Crawford's cooperation, but Crawford had double-crossed him, ensuring the gold remained hidden until after the war when it might serve justice rather than perpetuating slavery. Isaiah Crawford died in 1889, Jennifer continued, but he left journals that were discovered in his family's papers. He documented everything, including the location of this tunnel and the gold. His descendants knew about it but chose to leave it buried, thinking it was tainted wealth that should stay hidden. She looked at Sarah with an expression of wonder. "You found what generations deliberately left buried, and you made the choice they hoped someone eventually would." Sarah traced the faded handwriting in Crawford's journal, his careful documentation of every moral calculation and dangerous decision. He had been playing both sides, pretending to cooperate with Pritchard while actually working against the Confederacy, risking his life and his family's safety for a cause that barely acknowledged his humanity. The gold had been his insurance policy and his trap, wealth stolen from thieves and hidden away until someone with clean hands might discover it. "There's a historical marker going up at Crawford's homesite next month," Jennifer said. "His descendants want you there for the ceremony. They said what you did, giving up the gold for the right reasons, it honored Isaiah's memory better than anything else could have." The ceremony was held on a crisp October afternoon at a small park where Crawford's blacksmith shop had once stood. His descendants, numerous and successful, welcomed Sarah and Emma with warmth that felt unearned but genuine. An elderly woman named Ruth Crawford, Isaiah's great-great-granddaughter, took Sarah's hands and held them for a long moment. "My grandfather told me stories about the gold," Ruth said quietly. "How Isaiah hid it knowing someone would find it eventually, and that finding would be a test. You passed that test. You chose justice over wealth, community over self. That's what Isaiah hoped for." Sarah wanted to protest that her choice hadn't been noble, just necessary, just the only path she could take and still look her daughter in the eye. But Ruth's expression suggested she understood that morality wasn't about grand gestures but about small decisions made when easier paths were available. Sarah had chosen the harder path, and that choice had echoed across generations in ways she was only beginning to understand. Emma made friends with some of Ruth's great-grandchildren that day, running through the park while adults talked about history and legacy and the strange ways the past reached into the present. Sarah watched her daughter play, thinking about how different Emma's life would have been if Sarah had kept the gold, if they had run and hidden and built a fortune on stolen wealth. They might have had more money, but they wouldn't have had this connection to community and history and people whose stories intersected with theirs in unexpected ways. Winter came early that year, first frost arriving in November and coating the fields with crystalline beauty. Sarah and Marcus worked together to winterize both farmhouses, his and hers, talking about maybe combining the properties officially when spring came. The land between them could be unified, the old boundary fences removed, creating something larger and more viable. Emma loved the idea of having more space to explore, more room for the small horse Marcus had promised to teach her to ride. The financial compensation from the state had been managed carefully. Sarah's debts were paid, Emma's medical trust was secure, and what remained had been invested conservatively. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't desperate either, and that middle ground felt like the greatest luxury Sarah had ever known. She worked part-time at the agricultural cooperative, managed the rental of several acres to neighboring farmers, and was learning sustainable farming practices from Marcus and the agricultural extension office. The life she was building wasn't dramatic or remarkable, just steady and honest in hers. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling softly outside and a fire crackling in the wood stove, Sarah found herself thinking about the girl she had been 3 years ago. Desperate, sleeping in her car, spending her last $400 on an abandoned farmhouse because she had no other options. That Sarah had been looking for shelter and found instead a test of character that revealed who she was when faced with wealth that came at the cost of her integrity. She thought about Daniel, Emma's father, who had disappeared rather than face responsibility. Sometimes Sarah wondered if he knew about the gold discovery, if he had seen her face in those brief news cycles and felt regret or anger or nothing at all. She had stopped trying to find him years ago, had accepted that Emma's family was built from choice rather than biology. Marcus had become the father Emma needed, steady and present in ways Daniel never could have been. Sarah's parents had reached out after seeing the news coverage, tentative emails and phone calls offering reconciliation. Sarah had responded cautiously, maintaining boundaries but allowing a slow rebuilding of relationship. They visited twice that year, staying in a motel in town and coming to the farmhouse for carefully orchestrated dinners where everyone tried too hard to be pleasant. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, a fragile bridge across years of hurt and misunderstanding. Emma thrived in the space between past and future, grounded in the present in ways Sarah envied. She knew the basic outline of their story, how they had been poor and desperate and found something valuable that helped them build a better life. But Emma's understanding was filtered through a child's perspective, simplified into moral absolutes about doing the right thing even when it was hard. Sarah hoped her daughter would maintain that clarity, that sense that choices mattered and character was built through small decisions rather than grand gestures. By spring, the farmhouse that Sarah had bought for $400 had become the center of something larger than she had imagined. The Crawford family returned for another gathering, this time bringing genealogists and historians who were documenting Isaiah's role in the Underground Railroad. Sarah's property became part of that documentation, a site where history had been preserved and brought to light. The tunnel remained sealed, but a small museum in town created an exhibit about the discovery, featuring photographs and artifacts and Sarah's testimony about finding the gold and choosing to report it. Children on field trips learned about Confederate gold and the complexities of Civil War history, about how wealth created through slavery had been hidden and then used for education and justice. Sarah visited the exhibit once, walking through displays that turned her desperate year into historical narrative. It felt strange seeing her life reduced to placards and timelines, but also oddly validating, proof that her choice had mattered beyond her immediate circumstances. Marcus's children visited that summer, drawn by curiosity about their father's new family. The reunion was awkward at first, adult children confronting the reality of their father's life after their mother's death, but Emma's innocent enthusiasm broke through the tension. By the end of the week, they were making plans to return for Thanksgiving, to bring their own children and start building the kind of extended family that required work but felt worth the effort. The land itself seemed to respond to the attention and care. Fields that had been overgrown and neglected began producing again, first just cover crops but then vegetables in the large garden Sarah and Emma planted together. They learned to can and preserve, filling the cellar with jars of tomatoes and beans and pickles that reminded Sarah of her grandmother's farm. The circle of life and season and harvest that had seemed impossible in the city became natural here, rhythms that ordered their days and connected them to something older than their personal struggles. On the anniversary of finding the gold, Sarah walked alone to where the tunnel entrance had been sealed. The grass had grown over the concrete, softened by time and weather, and only someone who knew what to look for would notice the slight irregularity in the ground. She stood there thinking about Clayton Pritchard and Isaiah Crawford, about the gold that had passed through their hands and into hers, about the choices each of them had made and the consequences that rippled across generations. The land remembered everything, Sarah thought. Every theft and sacrifice, every act of courage and cowardice, every life that had been lived and lost on this soil. The farmhouse had witnessed poverty and wealth, slavery and freedom, desperation and hope. And now it witnessed Sarah and Emma building something new, not untouched by history but informed by it, shaped by the understanding that legacy was built through daily choices rather than single dramatic moments. Emma called from the house, her voice bright with some new discovery or question, and Sarah turned away from the sealed tunnel toward the life she had chosen. The gold was gone, transformed into scholarships and museum exhibits and education that served justice rather than perpetuating old evils. What remained was this farmhouse, this land, this family built from choice and circumstance and the determination to do right even when it cost everything. The sun was setting over the fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that reminded Sarah why she stayed, why she had chosen this harder path. The abandoned farmhouse she had bought with her last $400 had become a home, a legacy, a place where the past and future met in the present moment. In that transformation, quiet and earned and built day by day through ordinary choices, was worth more than any amount of Confederate gold hidden in the darkness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.